The meat industry is one of the biggest drivers of climate change and environmental destruction. In this video, I will expose how the meat industry contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation, and why we need to eat less meat to save the planet. Greenhouse gas emissions are gases that trap heat in the atmosphere and cause global warming. The main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. According to a major study published in Nature Food, the global production of food is responsible for 17.3 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year, which is 35% of all human-caused emissions. But not all foods are equal in terms of their climate impact. The same study found that meat accounts for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions from food production, while plant-based foods account for only 29%. This means that meat production causes twice as much pollution as plant-based food production. Why is meat so bad for the climate? There are several reasons. First, the destruction of forest ecosystems. Forests are natural carbon sinks that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in trees and soil. But forests are being cleared at an alarming rate to make room for livestock grazing and feed crops. For example, in Brazil, cattle farming is the main cause of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, which is home to 10% of the world's biodiversity and plays a crucial role in regulating the global climate. Second, the emission of methane and nitrous oxide. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is 28 times more potent than CO2 over a 100-year period. Methane is produced by cows and other ruminant animals as they digest their food. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that is 265 times more potent than CO2 over a 100-year period. Nitrous oxide is released by the use of fertilizers and manure on livestock feed crops. Together, methane and nitrous oxide account for about half of all greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture. Third, the inefficiency of animal protein. To produce 1 kilogram of wheat, 2.5 kilograms of greenhouse gases are emitted. But to produce 1 kilogram of beef, 70 kilograms of greenhouse gases are emitted. This means that beef production emits 28 times more greenhouse gases than wheat production per unit of protein. This is because animals require a lot of feed, water, land, and energy to grow and maintain their body mass, while plants can directly convert sunlight into biomass. The bottom line is that eating meat is bad for the climate and the environment. By reducing our meat consumption, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and our ecological footprint. According to a UN report, shifting to a more plant-based diet is one of the most important actions we can take to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Eating less meat is not only good for our health, but also for our planet. In this section, I will expose how the meat industry spreads misinformation and lobbying to downplay its environmental impact. The meat industry is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, responsible for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gases from food production. But instead of acknowledging this fact and taking action to reduce its emissions, the meat industry is using various tactics to confuse, defend, and downplay its role in the climate crisis. One of these tactics is to create an army of influencers and citizen activists who are trained by the industry to spread misleading narratives about beef sustainability. These advocates are taught to use scientific-sounding arguments that downplay the impact of cattle on land use, water consumption, deforestation, and methane emissions. They are also encouraged to engage with consumers online and offline and respond to any misinformation about beef production and other beef-related issues. Another tactic is to borrow strategies from the tobacco and fossil fuel industries to obfuscate the truth about climate change. The meat industry has funded think tanks and lobby groups that cast doubt on the scientific consensus that animal agriculture is a major driver of global warming. They have also influenced public policies and regulations that favor their interests and undermine climate action. For example, they have opposed carbon taxes, supported subsidies for animal feed, and blocked attempts to introduce dietary guidelines that recommend less meat consumption. By spreading misinformation and lobbying, the meat industry is trying to convince everyone that dietary change has no role in climate strategy. They are ignoring the overwhelming evidence that shows that reducing meat consumption, especially beef, is one of the most effective ways to lower greenhouse gas emissions and prevent catastrophic climate change. They are also denying the benefits of plant-based foods, which have much lower environmental impacts than animal-based foods. The meat industry is not only harming the planet, but also our health and well-being. By promoting a high-meat diet, they are increasing the risk of chronic diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. They are also contributing to animal suffering, antibiotic resistance, food insecurity, and social injustice. The meat industry is not sustainable or ethical, and we need to expose their lies and hold them accountable for their actions. In this section, I will show you how I investigated and exposed the meat industry's lies using data and evidence. The meat industry is one of the biggest contributors to climate change, but it tries to hide this fact by spreading misinformation and lobbying governments. First, I looked at the scientific studies that show how much greenhouse gas emissions are caused by meat production. According to a recent study published in Nature Food, meat accounts for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gases from food production, and beef alone accounts for a quarter of emissions produced by raising and growing food. This means that a single kilo of beef creates 70 kilograms of emissions, which is equivalent to driving a car for 500 kilometers. Second, I compared the environmental impacts of meat production with plant-based foods. I found out that meat requires more land, water, energy, and fertilizer than crops do. For example, the majority of all the world's cropland is used to feed livestock, not people. This leads to deforestation, biodiversity loss, and soil degradation. In fact, the large majority of deforestation in the Amazon region is due to farmers clearing land for cattle ranching. Third, I exposed the direct emissions of methane from animals, especially cows and sheep. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas that traps around 100 times as much heat as carbon dioxide while it persists in the atmosphere. Animals release methane as they digest their food, and this accounts for 57% of all food production emissions. The meat industry tries to downplay this by claiming that methane is short-lived and can be offset by planting trees, but this is misleading and ignores the cumulative effect of methane on global warming. Finally, I revealed how the meat industry influences public opinion and policy through lobbying, advertising, and funding research. The meat industry spends millions of dollars every year to promote its products and to oppose any regulations that would limit its emissions or environmental impacts. It also funds studies that cast doubt on the link between meat consumption and climate change, or that exaggerate the benefits of meat for health and nutrition. By using data and evidence from reliable sources, I was able to uncover the truth behind the meat industry's lies and show how eating meat is bad for the climate. I hope this video will inspire you to reduce or quit your meat consumption and to support more sustainable and ethical alternatives.